In the previous two episodes, I discussed how the pandemic is used as a front for tackling overconsumption, which is the developed world's problem, and overpopulation, which is the developing world's problem. In this episode, I will discuss how the pandemic is used as a front for tackling the decarbonization agenda, which is the umbrella term used to describe the overabuse of nature, thus environmental exploitation, in order to prevent the collapse of nature, for which we are all responsible, though not in equal measure. To prevent the destruction of nature, governments and the UN system have agreed that decarbonization is necessary and are aggressively pursuing it behind the pandemic front. Decarbonization being the process of lowering greenhouse gas emissions by replacing fossil fuels with renewable energy sources. According to the scientific consensus, absent deep decarbonization, the planet will warm up by more than 2 degrees Celsius by mid-century, and the climate will shift from a stable to an unstable state, making agriculture impossible in many parts of the world, displacing hundreds of millions of people from coastal areas due to rising seas, and causing extreme weather events with dire economic and human consequences. How decarbonization is pursued behind the veil of this plandemic is the focus of this episode. All attempts to date to lower greenhouse gas emissions have failed. The carbon trading scheme, which is the result of the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, has encouraged firms and countries to buy and sell carbon permits, but turned out to be a total failure, as it did not succeed in reducing carbon emissions, which kept increasing by 1% a year. A carbon tax, unless global and globally enforced, would simply see firms migrating to countries without one, and has proved to be politically impossible. And switching the energy and transport grid away from fossil fuels and onto renewable energy sources faces enormous costs and technical obstacles that have yet to be overcome, such as how to store intermittent energy from solar and wind sources so it can be used when needed. The system therefore had to find a way of lowering greenhouse gas emissions now and in a substantial way, while the global population continues to grow by 1% annually and the economy by 3%. A tall order, if not an impossible task, without annihilating half the world's population, which was their former plan, by the way, but that I stopped them from implementing, at least temporarily. The reality is the situation is dire and is summed up as follows. Global average temperatures have increased by more than 1% since pre-industrial times. CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere are now well over 400 ppm, that's parts per million, their highest levels in over 800,000 years. Globally, we emit over 36 billion tons of CO2 per year, and this continues to increase. There are large differences, more than 100-fold in per capita CO2 emissions between countries. Today, China is the world's largest CO2 emitter, accounting for more than 1/4 of emissions. This is followed by the USA, the EU, with the USA with 15%, the EU with 10%, India at 7%, and Russia at 5%. But the USA has contributed more to global CO2 emissions to date, accounting for 25% of cumulative emissions. This is followed by the EU at 22%, China at 13%, Russia at 6%, and Japan at 4%. A large amount of CO2 is embedded in traded goods, which means some countries' emissions increase while others decrease when we look at emissions based on consumption rather than production. There are large inequalities in CO2 emissions. The world's poorest have contributed less than 1% of emissions, but will be the most vulnerable to climate change impacts. The world is not on track to meet its agreed target of limiting warming to 2%. Under current policies, expected warming will be in the range of 3.1 to 3.7 degrees Celsius. Clearly, nothing done so far has worked, since CO2 emissions have continued to grow by 1% a year, and we are racing towards the abyss faster and faster. Political and scientific leaders, in their desperation, decided to act. And act they did. First, they pulled Greta Thunberg out of a hat, made her into an environmental expert and hero overnight, and gave her the world's biggest political platforms to sound the alarm, thus setting the stage for the plandemic. Then they gave China the world stage, and China played its part as the source of a killer virus that may have escaped from a lab and is presumably engineered to be a bioweapon. Just the kind of misinformation needed to cause fear and panic. To raise the level of fear and panic to a maximum, we are shown people dropping dead in the streets of Wuhan, after which the Chinese government quarantined the entire city, 11 million people, followed by entire regions. Within a month, China quarantined 800 million people, an unprecedented quarantine, and shut down all non-essential industries, which crippled the entire global supply chain, which is totally dependent on China. China went first for two reasons. First, to serve as an example to all other nations that without radical action, the virus cannot be stopped. And secondly, to shut down the global economy, China being the world's manufacturing hub. As a one-party state, China can impose restrictions that annihilate all rights and liberties, and no one can do anything about it. And as the world's factory, all other nations and all industries depend on China for parts, materials, and supplies. Italy went next. Why? To shut down all borders, stop all travel, bring all non-essential industries to a halt, and bring the fear to Europe. Had China not gone first, Italy could not have used China's example, and the government could not have quarantined the region of Lombardy and then all other northern provinces, thus depriving people of all their fundamental rights and liberties. The rest of Europe followed suit and the same script, with the UK at the tail end because it has the freest society in Europe and the longest tradition of human rights and liberties. The US came last for the same reason as the UK, because it has the most powerful institutions and the freest society in the world, where any infringement on civil rights and liberties would meet with strong opposition, which is exactly what happened despite the heavy and relentless propaganda. To make sure that all people accept being locked in their homes, supposedly to stop the spread of the pandemic, the UK and the Netherlands were allowed to pretend for a while that they try a different approach, one that does not involve lockdown, only to rethink their approach, apologize for making a mistake, and impose a lockdown like everyone else. The role of last ace in the hand was given to Sweden, which was the only European nation allowed to stay open throughout the pandemic, but only so it can regret its decision and thus exonerate all other nations that have ruined their economies with a lockdown. The pandemic is nothing more than a global stage production, a plandemic, that has given governments the excuse and the plausible deniability they needed to bring the global economy to a standstill so as to reduce consumption and greenhouse gas emissions by imprisoning half the world's population in the house, the half responsible for most of the world's consumption and greenhouse gas emissions, and to shut down all non-essential industries, bankrupt tens of thousands of companies and put countless millions out of work in order to give nature a chance to recover and also to set the stage for a restructuring of the global economy along the sustainability prerogative. The tourism, hospitality, aviation, professional sports, entertainment, and retail industries were shut down and have yet to be reopened. These being non-essential industries, the system has decided to sacrifice them and to reshape them into much smaller versions of themselves in order to lower the world's carbon emissions by 7%, the target set by the International Panel on Climate Change and the IPCC to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. By lowering carbon emissions, the system hopes to safeguard all 10 planetary boundaries: climate change, biodiversity loss, the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle, ocean acidification, land use, fresh water, ozone depletion, atmospheric aerosols, and chemical pollution. Decarbonization is the chosen strategy to prevent transgressing all 10 planetary boundaries, which is why denying climate change is really a moot point. What could not be accomplished with carbon trading deals and international negotiations has been accomplished with quarantines, lockdowns, and curfews. Thus, with the global response to the pandemic, which closed borders, shut down air travel, emptied streets, shuttered stores, and brought industry to a halt. By early April, all G20 nations had lowered their greenhouse gas emissions by far more than just the 7% needed. The US, for instance, by 32%, and the UK by 30%. Globally, greenhouse gas emissions plunged 17%. According to the Global Carbon Project, traffic restrictions accounted for 43% of the emissions drop, and reduced power and industrial production accounted by a further 43%. Now, these gains, however, would be reduced to just 4% if economic activity and mobility would be allowed to return to normal by mid-June, or by 7% if some restrictions remain worldwide until the end of the year, which would be the largest single annual decrease in absolute emissions since the end of World War II. And that is why social distancing and the wearing of masks were introduced as conditions for easing lockdown, and why politicians, health officials, media commentators, and all kinds of celebrities keep telling people to stay home, and why governments delayed the reopening of tourism, aviation, restaurants, malls, theaters, cinemas, concerts, and so on. If everything is closed, people have nowhere to go, nothing to consume, and will thus cause no greenhouse gas emissions. Everything is driven by the climate change agenda, and not one measure taken so far has been driven by the pandemic prevention agenda. Since there is no pandemic and no human health crisis, but there is a dire environmental crisis. The plan, scripted and followed by all G20 nations, has been three-pronged. The first batch of policies targeted long-distance travel and consist of isolation of sick or symptomatic individuals, self-quarantine of travelers arriving from affected countries, screening passengers at transport hubs, ban on mass gatherings of more than 5,000 people, closure of selected national borders, restricted international travel, and citizen repatriation. The second batch of policies was aimed at stopping 50% of society from normal daily routines and consist of closure of all national borders, a mandatory closure of schools, universities, public buildings, religious or cultural buildings, restaurants, bars, and other non-essential businesses within a city or region, ban of public gatherings of more than 100 people, mandatory night curfews, and 2-week enforced isolation or self-isolation of asymptomatic individuals. And a third batch of policies aimed to substantially restrict the daily routine of all but key workers and consist of mandatory national lockdowns that require household confinement of all but key workers, ban on all public gatherings, and the enforcement of the 2-meter social distancing rule. The results these measures have had on people's activity are extraordinary, as one would expect. Aviation suffered the largest drop at 75%, surface transport dropped 50%, industry 35%, the public sector 33%, and power 15%. The residential sector was the only one that saw an increase of 5% since people were confined at home. As a result, global emissions from surface transport fell 36% and made the largest contribution to the total emissions change. The power sector fell by 7.4%, the industry sector by 19%, the aviation sector by 60%, and the public sector by 21%. The only emissions growth was registered in the residential sector at 2.8%. The biggest drop in emissions until the end of April has occurred in China, with a decrease of 242 million tons of CO2, followed by the United States with a decrease of 207 million tons, then the EU in third place with a decrease of 123 million tons, and fourth by India with a decrease of 98 million tons of CO2. The fourth largest CO2 emitters in the world, therefore, decreased their emissions in the same order as the global ranking. China, being the biggest polluter in the world, decreased its emissions the most, followed by the US, the EU, and then India, which is, of course, no coincidence, but the direct effect of the severity of their lockdowns, and thus the result of deliberate planning. And only deliberate planning will ensure that these drops in emissions are not just temporary, but permanent, for they do not yet reflect structural changes in the economic, transport, and energy systems. These structural changes have yet to come, and they will come at a heavy price and will not result in higher well-being if they will be pursued once again through mandatory confinement under various lies. The plandemic has created a window for radical change, or at the very least for incremental change. To make the drops in CO2 emissions permanent, governments are attaching climate-related conditions to stimulus packages to restart the economy, stimulus packages that defund fossil fuel infrastructure and fund renewable energy. Governments are also introducing policies to reduce urban car traffic and to replace gas engines with hybrids and electric cars. By making massive green investments, governments hope to achieve a longer-lasting structural change that confine polluting industries to the past and bring green industries to the forefront. Stimulus programs are designed towards long-term climate mitigation goals. Only companies that are already moving towards meeting the Paris Climate Agreement goals will be funded, while those that submit no plans for decreasing emissions will be forced to go under. The engineered crash of the global economy and of global emissions is meant to lead to a sustainable new economy. The short and medium-term effects are and will continue to be extremely painful. As companies are going bankrupt or shrinking, they are laying off millions of workers, and unemployment has exploded to record highs. The World Bank predicts the biggest global recession in 80 years. This is not the climate stabilizations we have been promised. What we were promised is increased well-being, not record unemployment, record bankruptcies, and record misery. Yet national leaders have started announcing their plans for making the economy more carbon neutral. On April 28, German Chancellor Angela Merkel has declared that the European Green Deal must be the driving force behind Europe's economic recovery plan, and reaffirmed her support for raising the EU's emissions reduction targets for 2030 from 40% to 55%. She said the climate must not be excluded from the economic stimulus packages currently being put together. She described carbon pricing as an important instrument for achieving the EU's climate goals and expressed her hope that as many countries as possible will go for it. She also called for the extension of the EU's emissions trading system to new sectors and said that Germany intends to do this for heating and transport. A few hours earlier, EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen made similar declarations. She said that with billions of dollars of investment planned, we should not fall back into old habits of environmental degradation, but learn from the pandemic. She also advocated for investing in renewable energy, clean cars, and climate-friendly homes to make the bloc's Green Deal the motor for economic recovery. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, not to be undone, called on the EU to show global leadership and present tougher emission targets for the years up to 2030 by the end of the year. Any hesitation would only lead to more costs, both in terms of loss of life and economic losses, he said. The highest cost is the cost of doing nothing. On May 27, the EU announced a 1.8 trillion post-pandemic recovery plan with green objectives tied into it that are worth 60 billion euro, of which 40 billion are earmarked for a climate-neutral Europe. On June 3rd, German Chancellor Angela Merkel announced that governing parties have agreed on a 130 billion euro stimulus package to help revive the virus-hit economy. The package includes a 50 billion euro fund for addressing climate change, innovation, and digitization within the German economy. Clearly, the decarbonization prerogative looms large behind the pandemic illusion and is the primary objective that governments and the UN system have decided to pursue with the coronavirus as a front. But unless they bring their true objectives out in the open and pursue them lawfully, they will not succeed, because nothing lasting can be built on lies.